to the Peak Experience. This is a podcast about the customer experience, the agent experience, and everything in between. Our guest today is Grady Ward, a visiting fellow at the Integrity Institute, which is a think tank focused on protecting the social internet. So we're talking about how we can make the internet, particularly social media, a better and safer place to be for everyone. This is something of particular interest to our industry, the outsourcing industry, because like many outsourcing companies, we do content moderation for various clients. In its simplest form, what that means is that when people misbehave online, we've got teams of people who review posts and decide if they should be taken down. But what if we could prevent that misbehavior from happening in the first place? We can't eliminate all bad behavior, but we can reduce it with smart platform design. And that is why we're talking with Grady. So Grady, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and how did you come to this role as a fellow at the Integrity Institute?
Yeah, for sure. I'm a software engineer by training, and I worked at Google for a number of years and finished my career there working in a counter abuse team. And I really enjoyed that work. But the more I learned about the space, the more I realized that as a software engineer, most of my job was actually figuring out how product decisions were going to lead to user abuse. And then that pivoted a lot of my role there from just purely working on the code to helping folks think through the policy and how to think through the product decisions that would hopefully make my job as a software engineer easier and ultimately require fewer manual reviews, less direct content moderation.
So tell us about your work, how you transitioned from there to the Integrity Institute.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot about the second half of that question. So I left Google a few years ago, and I got involved at the Integrity Institute as a way to just continue learning in this space and continuing to grow my set of understandings about content moderation. I really enjoy and think the adversarial thinking is a really interesting set of problems, and the Integrity Institute has allowed me to stay in connection with those conversations. I applied for a visiting fellowship a few months ago because I'd had enough conversations with regulators and product managers about these design questions that ended with the idea of it would be great if there was some kind of guide that helped people to think through these issues. And so I got a visiting fellowship at the Integrity Institute to build that guide.
So it's a guide to how to build a platform in a way that minimizes harm. Is that safe?
Exactly. To say? Yeah, you pitched it better than I could.
So it's an incredible tool. We will include the link in the comment section and in the introduction to the podcast so folks can check it out. And Grady will talk more about it today. So yeah, talk about this work. What was your goal and how did you start?
Yeah, so the way my brain works is I try and decompose and kind of discretize a problem. And so what I tried to first think through was how can we taxonomize online harm? Because the types of harms that happen online can be differentiated along a lot of different bases, and that can help us think through how they can be addressed and mitigated. And so what I built first was kind of this taxonomy of harm, and then from that,
describe what you mean by that.
Yeah, sorry. It's essentially like a big glossary that describes different types of harms and provides concise definitions of different features of those harms, links to helpful resources on those harms and people working in the space, and then tries to tie in each of those individual types of harm, like cyberbullying, like spam, like harassment, tries to tie each individual type to the sets of features that platforms provide that make those harms more prevalent or make those harms possible, and tries to quantify those relationships and describe in what way does the platform aid the perpetuation of harm, and how can that relationship be tweaked so that the features the platform provides can less directly enable that harm.
So talk a little bit more about that taxonomy. Harassment, I know, is one of the categories. Fraud. What are all the categories you looked at?
Oh, yeah. So there's 48 of them. So I won't talk too many about all of them. But what I essentially tried to do is I collected a lot of resources from a lot of the internet of people already writing about these kind of harm guides and tried to collect them in terms that people are already using to describe online harm, right? So, some people might talk about child sexual abuse as a singular issue on the internet, and other people might talk about grooming or child sexual abuse imagery as distinct ideas. And so what I tried to do was use the language that people are already searching for to provide this really robust overview of the wide variety of harms that occur online. And harm here can be really direct, right? It can be something like user A does something which directly upsets or causes harm to user B, but they can also be really diffuse, things like addiction or ad fraud or political misinformation. There's a lot of ways in which the harms can either be acute and can be individualized or can be kind of societal and collective.
Yeah. What are some of the things that surprised you about this research? Did you learn some things that you didn't expect?
Yeah, I had a great time doing this project, in large part because I was amazed at the volume of things people are already doing in the design space and how effective they seem to be. So one of the really kind of shining examples from this piece for me was recognizing and realizing that many social platforms, particularly the large, well-funded ones, actually have a large variety of controls built in to allow users to protect themselves in ways that are pretty nuanced and well thought through. Those aren't necessarily readily accessible to most users or aren't the clearest things for most users. But I think that one of the things that was heartening about this project was realizing that people have been thinking about design very intentionally, and at well-funded platforms, this is a pretty significant part of their integrity practice. The thing that I found kind of disheartening on the other side of that coin was recognizing how very, very small interventions on platforms that might have significant potential for alleviating harm are often not taken just because they have financial implications, right? I think there's a lot of harm that happens online because folks at platforms have competing objectives between user safety and financial incentive, and it's hard. I don't envy being in that position, but I think, unfortunately, more platforms than I would like take the financial incentive piece of that.
Yeah. So I want to actually, we're going to dig into a lot of those design details and what could platforms be doing differently. But you also mentioned there are steps that people could be taking and aren't taking online to protect themselves. What are some of those things, and what are the top things that you would advise parents to do for their kids or people just to do for themselves?
Yeah, I think a first really good step is exploring the functionality and the settings menus of any apps that a child is using really deeply. I think it's really interesting to me that Facebook and Instagram in particular, but TikTok as well, have implemented a wide range of parental controls that are actually fairly potentially effective, but they are. I don't know whether intentionally, they seem to be obfuscated from user view, right? So these platforms tend to not make safety a prime front and center concern. So I think one of the first things that parents and individuals can do is certainly to try and explore the options that are available to them.
It's challenging. I mean, I think no matter how well these platforms do. I mean, I've got a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old who have started watching YouTube. And I said, oh, shoot, now I've got to figure this out. I thought I had a few more years before I had to figure out this whole parental control thing. But it's a big new thing that you've got to figure out. I think it's a challenge to do. And there's so many different platforms. You've got to do it on all of them.
And I think one of the things that we maybe don't talk enough about in that conversation is that the burden here falls on every parent to become an expert on every single platform that their child uses, as opposed to on, I don't know, governments to regulate the effective use of technology in interactions with children. I think that we really tend to center individual responsibility on the internet in a way that really diminishes the capacity for platforms to cause collectivized harms. And one of the other audiences of this project is not just the product managers that can think about how to make their platforms less harmful, but also the regulators to think about how could small changes in regulation or small changes in liability regimes change how platforms have to operate in a way that would reduce harm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of the platforms are actually advocating for that as well.
Yes. Yeah. I think we can expect to see some motion on that in the next few years, but I'm hopeful, but not too optimistic.
Yeah. So let's dig into some of the details. Harassment. I think this is a big one. How can platforms be designed in a way that minimizes harassment?
Yeah, so I think harassment is such a good example. So thank you for bringing it up. Because one of the things that we can kind of intuit as we navigate different online spaces is that the harassment we see is largely cultural, right? So if you are browsing 4chan, you are going to see a larger degree of harassment and a larger degree of, threats, violence, etc. And a large part of that is because the platform's operations and the culture that it's developed over time have engendered a comfort with harassment, right? Like that is kind of an expected part of the culture of that platform. And so one of the, I think, best design questions to ask is if harassment is happening on a platform, how and why do harassers feel comfortable doing so, right? What is it about the design of perhaps the identity features of a platform, like, how many accounts can a user have? What types of, authentication regimes exist that allow a harasser to feel that they can harass with impunity, or that they can, create a bunch of accounts to harass from multiple accounts, that kind of thing. And then another really big piece of harassment is the demographics and intent of a site. So a lot of the times when we think about harassment in online platforms, we tend to blame anonymity, right? Saying that, oh, on the internet, anyone can harm anyone else, and that's why people do it. But I think we should first think about platforms as spaces, right? So when you go to various physical spaces, there are different norms and expectations of behavior that we all abide by through the communicated expectations of that space. We tend not to yell in a library, and we tend to yell in a club, and those two are expected behaviors and patterns that the system around the space expresses to its users, both through its rules, right? Things like if you yell in a library, you will get kicked out, but also through the behavior of other users and how those users are rewarded or dissuaded from that. So on the harassment front, one of the things that I think plays a huge role in harassment is the design of comment systems. So comment systems that are based on upvotes or based on other measures of user engagement tend to be a space that prioritizes the idea of like dunking or intentionally disrespecting or calling someone out for a bad idea, right?
Because that gets a lot of attention.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like if people are maximizing for attention, they're going to maximize for things that are sensational and funny and maybe not respectful or kind or thoughtful. And similarly, a great example too on the spam front on comment systems is when comment systems show the first comment first, you tend to get a lot of really low quality replies immediately, right? So this was a phenomenon on Twitter from 2008 called reply guys. And there was this whole thing where people would just go on and just randomly enter things so that they could be at the top of the list. And I think the comments are a beautiful example because we tend to think of them as a single thing, but every single platform actually does comments slightly differently, right? Reddit has these nested comments where it's like a tree structure, and other places have kind of linear comments or one indent comments. And I don't think they're the right design for comments, but I think that in designing a space, if harassment is a issue within comments, you can think about, okay, why is it that users are interacting with this system in a way that seems to be responding to its incentives?
Yeah. Interesting. What about also, I mean, a lot of harassment happens in direct messages. What about that?
Yeah, so I think a really, really powerful tool, and actually zooming back for a second, one of the things that I'm really proud of with this site is there's a bunch of interventions which are just like ideas for how to change things. Those aren't like particularly well thought out, but I tended to group them together. And I want to be clear, I don't take credit for most of these intervention ideas. A lot of them came from existing interventions. A lot of them came from proposed interventions. But what I tried to do is organize them into collections of like types of approaches to changing platforms and how they can help. So in response to your question about harassment in DMs, I think that the biggest tool we have in that toolkit is affinity, or the idea of how does a user's existing relationship with another user increase or decrease the level of trust and capacity they should have in response to that user, right?
Mhm.
So, in the real world, it's very unlikely that I want to receive a DM from anyone who I don't have, like, let's say, a third-degree LinkedIn connection with.
Mhm.
That's actually pretty unlikely. And that's not to say that those connections should never happen, but that if
Mhm.
the purpose of a site like LinkedIn is to try and facilitate the real world connection of professionals, then
Right.
affinity or their interconnectedness is a great tool to help
Yeah.
further that.
Well, or and I might be more likely to want that on LinkedIn, where it's a professional, than to want it on, Instagram, where I'm there for personal reasons.
Yeah, for sure. It's well said.
So misinformation. We're now officially in an election year in the United States. Talk about misinformation and what can be done there.
Yeah, misinformation is a particularly hard problem because it directly it is in direct opposition to platforms' financial incentives. There's really good data that shows that misinformation content spreads much faster, gets more engagement, and generates more revenue for platforms than does appropriate, factually based news information. And so, platforms that have ranking algorithms that try to maximize their revenue or try to maximize their engagement are just going to be fighting an uphill battle on misinformation from the jump, right? And I think Facebook and Instagram and a bunch of other kind of US-based media have been trying to deprioritize news writ large because they have largely abdicated their ability to handle this effectively. That's not to say that there are not things that we can do, but I think that as long as a business model is based on maximizing engagement, there's certain kinds of harms that are going to be really hard to unravel.
Mm-hmm. But what can we do? There's got to be something.
Sure.
I have to assume these platforms want engagement. So they are going to be structuring algorithms to maximize engagement. Is there a way we can have our cake and eat it too? Is there a way we can try to maximize engagement, try to maximize profit, which every company is trying to do, but also do something.
I actually had nothing off the top of my head. So what I did was I went to the site that I
perfect, great.
there's
a free tool at the Integrity Institute. What are some of the ideas?
So actually, the top suggestion on here, which is actually one I now that I think about it, I actually really do like, is flattening virality curves. And so this is an idea of, like, if your platform is going to recommend content to people, you can think of a distribution of, let's say there's a piece of content that the algorithm expects is going to be very, very effective at driving engagement. If you display that to users immediately, and all of the users at the same time, you're going to get this distribution in views or impressions on that content that's super spiky, right? It might generate, it might go from 1 to 10 to 1 million views in a day, and then back down to 1 by the next day. In contrast, you could imagine changing algorithms such that they intentionally try and flatten out that curve, so that maybe that 1 million people might still see the content, but over the course of 2 to 3 weeks, as opposed to just seeing it all on that day. And, there's obviously liveness constraints with that might not meet the needs of a platform like Twitter that is intended for this kind of like live communication in real time. But at the same time, like, that kind of that slowing down of recommendations would give more time for people to, do manual content moderation, do manual fact checks, do the hard work to ensure that that content is getting enough scrutiny before it is viewed by that million people. And
so it's sort of a slower pace to becoming viral. We don't need to send something viral right away. We can try to take it a little bit slow and make sure that it's all right before we let it go everywhere.
Exactly. I mean, this was the idea behind the whole COVID flatten the curve thing.
Exactly.
Right? Like, everyone was talking about how we all might get infected with COVID, but if we all get infected at the same time, that might be good. And, like, election misinformation
gives us time to get the vaccine. It gives us time to get the vaccine. We're trying to buy time.
And in this case, the vaccine might be a good fact check, right?
Right. So now, did you focus mostly on social media companies, or, for example, online gaming is another area where, where there's content moderation, and where some of these harms are taking place? How did you focus your work?
Yeah, this is a good question. I really tried to focus on bundles of features as opposed to specific companies, mostly because, if you look across the internet, like any given site just is kind of an amalgamation of a couple different ideas, right? So there's comment systems, which we talked about. There's recommendation systems, which we talked about. There's messaging systems. But like any given platform might have several of those. They might be somewhat interrelated, but usually platforms offer these things as standalone features. And so what I tried to do is analyze things through those lens of those like fundamental core features. What are the harms that those drive?
Yeah. You know what, since a lot of people will be seeing this on video as opposed to on audio, do you want to share your screen and just give folks an idea of what we're talking about?
Oh, that's a great idea. Yeah, I will do that.
We should have done that at the beginning, so folks are rooted in a understanding of what it is, but better late than never.
So, so the site is features.integrity.institute.org. The site just kind of gives you the thesis. And the site uses these three colors to connect these three ideas of harm, design, and change, right? Which I think we've sketched through. It encourages folks to explore through the lens of harm. Here's the list of 48 of them if you're interested. But you can also kind of check things out by features or interventions. Let's check out what we were just talking about, election misinformation, if I can find it. Actually, I can't find it, so we'll just check out manipulated media deepfakes. Each page has kind of some structured data at the top that helps you filter and understand the connections between disparate ideas. It then has kind of a few paragraphs describing the harm, its origins, and its connections to design. And then it has the connections to the specific sets of features that most enable the design, and a couple of recommended changes. In this case, recording data about where media comes from. And then finally, at the bottom of every page is an edit button. I wrote the first draft of this site, but like I'm not the expert on anything. And so the site is now maintained and edited regularly by a bunch of folks at the Integrity Institute, working essentially on this as a wiki. Our hope is that this kind of becomes a resource that people can rely on in the long term. And as online abuse changes, I'm sure this site will need to be updated. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Can we also look at fraud? Sorry. Yeah.
That's fraud is another one that I think, is something we see at a lot of clients. I see ad fraud.
Yeah. Ad fraud's a very specific kind of fraud. But it's like when people set up recipe sites that just have nonsense garbage on them and then use it to click farm. There's other types of fraud as well, but I think they're I'm sorry, I feel like I don't have a ton of good information.
Oh, that's okay. Great. That's all right. If you want to
Can I show one more thing on the site?
Yes, please.
So one other cool feature of the site is it's really built to try and be a repository for information. So there's a really good, robust search functionality. And then there's also the capacity to sort and filter these things so that you can see, hey, what are the most effective things we could do to prevent X? Or, what are the lowest cost ways of doing Y? And so I think these are hopefully useful tools for people trying to synthesize a lot of this information. We also have executive summaries for lawmakers and software engineers. We have one for product managers and one for CIOs coming soon. And then there's a bunch of suggestions on how to get involved if you're interested in contributing to the project. We accept all of it. I think we've had 48 edits or so from people not in the Integrity Institute, and we accept.
That's awesome. Well, I really recommend that everyone check it out. It's an incredible tool. Let me ask you one more question, which is artificial intelligence. How do you see that impacting this, maybe amplifying some of these dangers, and what in particular can we do? We were just talking about deep fakes, for example. What in particular can we do with the increasing prevalence of artificial intelligence and the impact it might have here?
Yeah, I think this is a really hard question, and I'm sure we won't begin to scratch the surface in the time that we have. I think that the large picture of what's going to happen with artificial intelligence is that people are going to learn to not trust what they read online.
Mhm.
And I think that that is going to be a significant impediment to the majority of online content and online interaction patterns as they currently exist.
Mhm.
But I also think it presents a pretty significant opportunity, because as trust degrades in the internet writ large, I think there's a lot of potential for brands and for individual sites to figure out ways of bolstering their own reputations and their own image and their own value in a way that differentiates it from what will soon be a undifferentiated mass of artificially generated content.
Yeah.
And that trust, that brand building is, I think, an exercise that people should start thinking about now, so that in a few years, we're not just talking about the collapse of the internet.
Yeah. I speaking of my 7-year-old, he came up to me one day and said, did you know a person can hold their breath for 25 minutes? Which I think is something he learned on YouTube. And it just made me very concerned. As someone who grew up in the pre-internet world, I worry that my kids are, not going to develop that ability to distinguish between real and false information.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know about y'all, but I feel like when I was growing up and going through, college, people were always warning me against citing to Wikipedia, right? And there was this kind of general fear of knowledge that was on the internet.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is we've all kind of lost that fear over the last 10, 15 years, but I think we're going to regain it.
Yeah.
I think we're going to regain it sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Well, Grady, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it. I've learned a ton. I recommend everyone check out this tool if you're involved in this work. It's such important work for everyone. It's features.integrityinstitute.org. Was that correct?
That's the one. And
fantastic.
thank you so much for having us on.
Thank you so much.
Really